honorable guests, esteemed professors, and my fellow students. Welcome to the joint seminar series held by the College of Business and the School of Law. My name is Christopher Ching, and I'm a third-year student majoring in global business. It is my pleasure to be your Master of Ceremonies today. On behalf of CityU, I would like to welcome all of you to this seminar series. This event is organized by CityU College of Business and CityU School of Law. The joint seminar aims to facilitate innovative idea exchange between professors and students from different faculties and areas of study. Students are encouraged to think outside of the box through engaging with emerging technologies to create powerful and impactful global solutions. Today, we are extremely fortunate to hear more about the impacts and possibilities of new technologies from Professor Kelvin Lo from the School of Law. I would like to welcome Professor Wan Wai Yi, the Associate Dean of the School of Law, to introduce Professor Lo.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Kelvin Lo. He's Professor of Law at City University of Hong Kong. His research interest spans the field of private law, but with a particular interest in property. He has published internationally with leading journals such as the Law Quarterly Review, the Modern Law Review, the International and Comparative Law Quarterly, the American Journal of Comparative Law, and the Melbourne University Law Review. He is a co-author of the second edition of the Law of Personal Property, as well as a co-author of the third and fourth editions of Tan Soo Ee's Principles of Singapore Land Law, the leading Singapore land law text. He has served on numerous editorial positions in Singapore and Hong Kong, and is presently a co-editor of Trust Law International and co-editor-in-chief for the Asia Pacific Law Review. His research has been cited by courts in Australia, Canada, England and Wales, Hong Kong, Malaysia, New Zealand and Singapore, as well as law reform bodies in various Commonwealth jurisdictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wan. I would like to next invite Professor Fang Yulen from the Department of Information Systems to present a souvenir on behalf of the College of Business to Professor Kelvin Lo.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Right. Okay, so welcome everybody. Good morning to everyone. So the topic of my presentation is going to be Pause the Blockchain Legal Revolution. This is based off a paper of mine, also of the same title, published with the International Comparative Law Quarterly. So I am going to assume that some of the audience starts from a zero knowledge of blockchain. So please excuse the introductions as to how the technology works if you are familiar with it, because I think it wouldn't work otherwise this talk if I didn't actually do a basic introduction of how the blockchain works. You will also see from the presentation that I am a blockchain skeptic. Not to the point where I don't think that it can serve any purpose. I just think that there's a lot of hype, and the hype needs to die down before we can actually see what real function it serves. Okay, so as I think everybody knows, the blockchain was initially introduced by Satoshi Nakamoto as part of his white paper to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin, of course, was born of the ashes of the Great Recession, right? This was the Lehman Brothers crash. There was a loss of trust in central government bodies, central banks, and so on and so forth. So in October 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto published his white paper on Bitcoin. And he introduces the technology underpinning Bitcoin, which is actually the blockchain. Don't think the word blockchain appears in the white paper. And at the time, there was very little attention on either Bitcoin or blockchain, right? So when Bitcoin, the idea was first conceived, it was initially pretty much limited the interest to people called cypherpunks, not cyberpunks, cypherpunks, right? These are people who believe that cryptography can revolutionize the world. So it was basically tech geeks mostly that were interested in it. And Bitcoin really only exploded with the creation of cryptocurrency exchanges, of which probably the most famous is Mt. Gox. Those of you wondering why Mt. Gox is called Mt. Gox, it's because it was started by somebody who actually already had a website which was intended to trade Magic the Online Gathering cards. And so he just repurposed that website to trade cryptocurrency, hence the acronym Mt. Gox, MTGOX, right? So that's why Mt. Gox is called Mt. Gox. And Mt. Gox was not the first cryptocurrency exchange. I think it was second or third, but it was the first very successful one. And it led essentially to an increase in prices, which led to further adoption. It's a bit like a Ponzi scheme, except there's no schemer behind the scenes, right? But basically, when people jump in, the whole bubble mentality, right? People fear of missing out, people jump in. Now, what happened very significantly, I think, when attention shifted from cryptocurrencies to blockchains, right, was after the Mt. Gox hack in 2013. So Mt. Gox was famously hacked in 2013, and then there's a whole series of fall in prices, collapse in prices, and that's when attention shifted from cryptocurrencies to blockchains. And that's when people started talking about the blockchain being more important than cryptocurrencies, right? So you see a headline in The Economist, a whole issue that dedicated to the blockchain. This, I think, is in 2014, I believe. The Truth Machine, the blockchain and the future of everything. Anytime somebody tells you something is the future of everything, just don't believe it. It almost never is. Life is far too complicated for that. Blockchain, the next everything, again, similar problems. I think I'm not the first person to coin this phenomenon as cryptomania. Mania here simply, it doesn't mean you're mad. It simply means, if you look at the technical definition of mania, it's excessive enthusiasm. So bibliomania, Beatlemania, for example, right? So cryptomania sweeps the world from 2014 all the way through to about 2017. Then there's the big crash. And now you see interest again, all right? So Bitcoin has, depending on who you ask, broken new highs or testing new highs from the 2017 high. I don't believe it's breached $20,000 US yet, but I don't know, I haven't checked today. So I don't know how many of you watched Animaniacs. It's one of my favorite cartoons, and there's a segment in Animaniacs called Pinky and the Brain. And I liken a lot of the people who come up with crazy projects to use the blockchain to solve all manner of problems. And you do see the blockchain being proposed to solve all manner of problems, from gender inequality, consent to sexual relations, provenance tracking, land registries, IP registries, and so on and so forth, right? So I liken it to this particular segment. So Pinky and the Brain always starts out with this segment where Pinky asks, "Gee, Brain, what do you want to do tonight?" And Brain always answers the same thing we do every night: Pinky, try to take over the world. Now, if you just change the dialogue a little bit, so, "Gee, Brain, how do you want to solve tonight's problem?" Brain will answer, as a cryptomaniac, "Well, the same way we solve every problem, Pinky, with a blockchain." Now, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the saying, "A little knowledge is a dangerous thing." What many people probably don't remember is that it can be traced back to Alexander Pope, and the exact saying was, "A little learning is a dangerous thing." And what I tend to find in this, particularly in legal writings, right, is that the lawyers don't understand the technology and the tech people don't actually understand the law. And this creates a fundamental problem where we're actually not communicating with one another. We're using the same words, but the words have different meanings. And this is what creates the problem. So within the security sphere, but including InfoSec, there's this myth that there was once upon a time an era where we had what they called perfect security. And this era of perfect security started in the 1770s, with the invention of the Bramah lock, which is on screen, invented by Joseph Bramah. The Bramah lock supposedly provided perfect security because it was unpickable, right? And this era of perfect security ended with the Great Exhibition in London of 1851, when an American, Alfred Charles Fox, because Americans break everything, basically picked the unpickable locks. Now, by this time, not only was the Bramah lock supposedly unpickable, Chuck also had an unpickable lock, which was used to guard the royal jewels. So Hobbs basically picked the Chuck's unpickable lock in 25 minutes, right? And then repeated the performance in 7 minutes. And then he proceeded to pick the Bramah lock. Now, this proved a much greater challenge. It took 52 hours spread over 15 days to pick this lock. Now, the problem with this story, it's a very nice story. The problem with this story is that it omits consideration of other ways of getting behind what the lock is protected. I don't have to pick the lock. I can break the lock, right? I can enter via another entry point rather than the lock. So, the perfect security does not exist, right? So transpose that to the blockchain. Now, the blockchain is usually introduced in something like this, right? A shared, decentralized, cryptographically secure, and immutable digital ledger. And the part I am particularly interested in is cryptographically secure. What cryptography is used? What does it secure? And more importantly, and this is the part that most cryptomaniacs don't talk about, what does it not secure, right? So that's what I'm interested in. So let's start with a basic introduction to the blockchain, and the best way of doing that is using the Bitcoin example. How does a Bitcoin transaction work? And it's always Alice and Bob. Alice wants to pay Bob. Bitcoin, how does it work? So first, you must have a Bitcoin address, right? So you set up a Bitcoin address, and a lot of people talk about this as similar to a bank account. You have a bank account and a password. It's actually not quite the same. So the difference lies in the fact that your account, which is your public address, and your password, which is your private key, is encrypted. And it uses public key cryptography, sometimes called asymmetric cryptography. Now, asymmetric cryptography was introduced in 1976 by Diffie and Hellman, and it has been hailed as the most important revolution in cryptography. What is asymmetric cryptography? You have both the public and the private key. Now, this is different from previous cryptography, which was symmetric cryptography. Symmetric cryptography uses the same key operating in two different directions, right? You lock and then you unlock using the same key going forwards and backwards. The problem with symmetric cryptography is you have to share the key, right? So the more participants you have, then the less secure the entire system becomes, because any one of them can be hacked, right? So this is the problem with symmetric cryptography, the human problem. And you will see that it's actually the problem with all cryptography, it's the human problem. So asymmetric cryptography solves that problem by allowing you to share your public key, and the public key cannot unlock, right? It can only test and verify that the cryptography is correct. So that solves the human problem, right? This does not mean, however, asymmetric cryptography is better than symmetric cryptography. I'm told based on my research that symmetric cryptography is still the more widely used system. So it is really a question of using the correct solution for the correct problem. Now, what is the difference with a bank account? In a bank account situation, you can change your PIN, but you can't do that with asymmetric cryptography. The private key is cryptographically linked to the public key. So if you want to change your private key, you have to change your public key as well. You can't change the password, so to speak. And of course, if you lose your password, there's no one you can go to for help, right? If you lose your private key, you lose your private key, end of story, right? You can no longer access unless you can recover your private key. So it's not like a bank account where you go to the bank, you prove your identity by bringing your ID card, your passport, whatever it is. They do the verifications, they issue you with a new password. This does not work with private key cryptography. The other problem with private key cryptography is that, again, just because it is more secure, because it reduces the human problem, doesn't mean I can't hack you, all right? So if your private key is entered into the wallet, all right, the blockchain network can only tell that your private key was used. It cannot tell that the private key was used by you, right? It could have been used by you, or very famously using the metaphor, it could have been used by your dog, and the blockchain network cannot tell the difference, okay? So you use your private key to pay, right? To say, okay, I want to transfer X number of Bitcoins to Y. And then the system will do a verification. There are two sets of validations. There's technical validations. It must comply with the technical requirements. Is the message correctly formatted, so on and so forth. There's also the business logic validation. Do you actually have the Bitcoins you are purporting to pay? Now, at this point, we're talking now about permissionless networks, right? Because this is actually what has created a lot of interest. You have people who verify the transactions and append the transactions, right? They have to choose your transactions to put onto the blockchain. And these people are called miners, right? So the metaphor with mining is used because in the early days, and still for now, they are rewarded by newly created Bitcoins, okay? Increasingly, the rewards for newly created Bitcoins are lower, and therefore transaction fees are going up, right? So in the early days, Bitcoin was a wonderful way of transferring wealth at very low cost, because the miners were rewarded through new Bitcoins, and so you didn't have to offer transaction rewards. So this made it attractive compared to, say, cross-border fund transfers, where banks always take a big cut. That's no longer the case. The transaction fees are now so high that Bitcoin no longer works for one of the originally conceptualized functions, which is microtransactions. It would make no sense for you to pay with Bitcoin for, say, a cup of coffee, because the transaction fees are going to be too high, right? It's just not worthwhile. So what do miners do? Miners solve a cryptography puzzle. Again, this is using a particular algorithm. So what they do is they solve a puzzle. They try to break the cryptography. And you can do this apparently using pen and paper. It's just going to be incredibly slow. You're not going to win the competition. So the difficulty level of the puzzle changes depending on how much hash power is thrown at the network. So hashing is a way of taking information of different values, let's say names, right? John, Alice, Mike, Zachariah, and turning it into information of fixed value, all right? So that's what hashing is. So what the miners try to do is solve the particular hash. And what happens is, even if you just change one small value, the hash function will be completely different. Now, what hashing this does then, of course, this system is called proof of work. Most blockchains, most permissionless blockchains use proof of work. Some are transitioning to proof of stake. Now, both proof of work and proof of stake are essentially based on game theory, the idea of how to use human behavior to ensure that there is protection against fraud, right? So very interestingly, proof of work is also called proof of waste, depending on your perspective. It was initially designed to prevent junk mail, invented in 1993 by Dwork and Norr, and it was named proof of work in 1999 by Jacobson and Joles. All right. So once the miner successfully solves the puzzle, he or she or they get to decide which transactions they will append to the blockchain. And normally, rational miners will pick transactions which offer the largest transaction rewards, right? So the more you offer, the more likely your transaction is going to be included. So, and then they will pick the transactions, they will include them, and they get what they call buried in the blockchain. Why is it called burying? Because this is what happens, right? So why is a blockchain called a blockchain? A blockchain is called blockchain because it chains blocks of transactions together. Now, if you look at your bank account is not tied to somebody else's, some stranger's bank account. Your transactions are segregated from other people's transactions, right? Your account ledger, you don't see other people's transactions. Not so in the blockchain. The blockchain groups transactions together. Now, why does it do this? It does this so that each block will then be hashed to the next block. So the next block will contain a hash of all the transactions in the previous block. And so this then allows people on the network to verify that nothing funny has gone on in the previous block, because they will check the hash value of the succeeding block. And if you hash all the transactions and the hash value doesn't match, you know somebody has basically tried to edit the information and you've detected it, right? So this is why the blockchain is called the blockchain. It prevents alteration of the ledger, right? And this is what people talk about when they say censorship resistance. Now, the problem with censorship resistance is it casts a positive light to this feature. I prefer a more neutral term. It's rectification resistance, right? Because when you say censorship, people tend to think, oh, censorship is bad, right? Censorship is not bad, right? It's just that we associate it with something bad. So we don't feel any problem if we say censor fake news, right? So it's the same thing. It's a neutral thing. At the end of the day, it is a feature. It prevents both good rectifications and bad rectifications, right? So now, again, this feature is not new, right? So according to Nicholas Weaver, who's a computer tech guy, I think at Berkeley, this technology, hash chains, has existed for at least 30 years, okay? So what essentially the blockchain does is it uses a lot of old technology and it combines them, right, into one new package. So what are some of the problems? Famously, of course, proof of work is ridiculously energy intensive. And if you don't burn through a lot of energy at a high price, then your blockchain is less secure, all right? So Nick Weaver suggests that if any blockchain is not burning at least US $100,000 per hour, then that blockchain is not secure. I would suggest that actually it depends on what the blockchain records, because the higher the value of what is recorded on the blockchain, then you have to burn more, because it will be very worthwhile spending 200,000 US dollars to get at a $2 million US asset. Right? So as more and more and greater value gets recorded on a blockchain, particularly if it is authoritative, then you need to burn more in order to secure it. This, of course, is environmentally unsustainable. So the figures obviously are not accurate because the slides were prepared a while ago. So there is a website that you can go to see what the current carbon footprint, what the electricity usage of the Bitcoin and the Ethereum network is. Now, and this is scary in and of itself, how much energy it uses, but it is even scarier when you compare the transaction speeds, right? Bitcoin currently processes about 4.6 transactions per second. That's crap compared to the kind of payment systems we're used to. Visa basically does about an average of 1,700 transactions per second, has been stress tested up to 65,000 transactions per second. Alipay in 2019 on Singles Day processed 544,000 transactions per second. So these are centralized systems. So clearly there's a scaling problem for the blockchain. Now I want to talk about security. Are blockchains secure? Because this is the most important part. I think it's quite clear, given that we started with the Mt. Gox hack, it's not. And there have been many, many hacks of cryptocurrency exchanges. Now you will say, okay, but hang on a minute, banks are also hacked. They're also bank transactions hacks. But if you look at cryptocurrency exchange hacks and compare that with the kind of bank fraud that we are used to, you will find that the hacks occur at different places. The traditional bank fraud instances, it is the customer that's hacked, right? So I know of very few instances where it is actually the bank that is hacked. So if you cast your memory back to the 2016 Central Bank of Bangladesh hack, it was, yes, the Central Bank of Bangladesh that was hacked, but the Central Bank of Bangladesh in that case was the customer of the American bank. So again, it was the customer that was hacked. The banks themselves are actually remarkably secure. There are very few hacks of the bank itself. Likewise, if I actually teach land law, if you look at land transaction frauds, it's never the registry. It's never the registry that's hacked. It is the end user, right? It is your husband, your wife, your child that defrauds you, right? So the blockchain does not, okay, it does not secure you. It only secures the network, okay? Now, look at the cryptocurrency hacks. These are the exchanges that are hacked, okay? Now, if banks were hacked and you lost your money, there would be protests in the streets. Why are there no protests for this? Okay, so this is not more secure. Now, it provides zero security for you as the end user. You have to basically be very, very careful with your private key. And you kind of face a dilemma. You have two problems that you need to cope with. You don't want to have only one copy, because if you only have one copy and you lose it, you lose access. You lose all your wealth. But every extra copy you have is an extra point of failure. So you need to navigate this twin, evil, so to speak, right? Every extra copy, how do you secure them? There are many ways of going after you, right? Quite apart from if you use a cryptocurrency exchange. So you hold the Bitcoin to yourself or whatever asset it is. You can be hacked. So what has happened in the past, people see who advertise that they own crypto assets on social networks, then they hack them, right? They've been hacked using two-factor authentication, right? Or, if let's say I'm the miscreant and I'm not very good with computer skills, I don't know how to hack you, very simple. I use violence, right? I point a gun to your head and I say, look, you either give me a private key or I blow your brains out. What do you think you're going to do? You're going to give over your private key, right? So there is absolutely zero security for the end user. And this is something that you need to remember when you hear all these grand claims about the blockchains revolutionizing the world. Think about, is your grandmother going to be secure using the blockchain? People talk about the blockchain being wonderful in third world countries where they have no trust in centralized authorities. Think about it. Is the guy, in Uganda going to be able to secure himself, right? Whether physically from violence or cryptographically, right? Using, all manner of firewalls, right? Doesn't work. These people don't have the resources to secure themselves. So this is a solution that does not work, right? So don't take my word for it. Computer experts say the same thing. Bruce Schneier, a very famous computer expert, says only amateurs attack machines, professionals attack target people, right? So they will go after you, they won't hack the network, right? Well, except in certain cases, which we will talk about in a bit. There's also this very famous quote from Professor Eugene Spafford. The only truly secure system is one that is powered off, cast in a block of concrete and sealed in a lead-lined room with armed guards. And even then, I have my doubts. So the point I'm trying to make is there's no such thing as perfect security, right? Bruce Schneier has an op-ed with Wired magazine. There's no good reason to trust blockchain technology. And his slide is just, I could have done this, but then it would be a very boring presentation. There's one slide. Do I need a blockchain? There's only one line. Answer, no. Right? And that's a computer security expert. So that's one element of the problem with blockchain security, the end user. And this is to me, the Achilles heel. But leaving that aside, you also have a problem with the network, right? So now, if we're talking network security, you need to distinguish between permissioned blockchains and permissionless blockchains. For permissioned blockchains, all right, network security is about 1/3. It is resistant to about 1/3 of the nodes being compromised. They tend to use what is called a practical Byzantine fault tolerance consensus algorithm. Now, all blockchains have to use a consensus algorithm because what you have are multiple nodes, and you need to ensure that all the nodes are identical, showing the same information. This is not a problem you have to deal with in a centralized system because there's only one node, right? I'm not saying centralized systems are therefore perfect. They could contain errors, but you don't have to ensure consensus for centralized systems. For decentralized systems, whether blockchains or not, you actually have to ensure consensus. For permissioned networks, it is resistant to 1/3 of the nodes being compromised. For permissionless networks, it's resistant to up to 51, what we call the 51% attack. Now, you may therefore think that permissionless networks are therefore more secure because you need to compromise 51% versus permissioned networks where you only need to compromise 1/3. You would be wrong. Why? Because for permissioned networks, you need permission to join the network. So you actually need to compromise the nodes that are actually already in the network. All right. For permissionless networks, firstly, when we talk about the 51% attack, we're not talking about compromising 51% of the nodes. We're talking about compromising 51% of the hash power of the network. So basically only the miners. All right. More importantly, because it is permissionless, you don't actually need to hack anything. You just set up your system, download the software, and join. And if you have the hash power, say you have access to a supercomputer because you rented it for 2 days, right? You can hack the system, right? So how does the 51% attack work? It works something like this, right? So one of the rules for permissionless networks is you mine on the longest chain. So whoever has the longest blockchain essentially wins, and the people with the shorter blockchains, that blockchain will be discarded. So if you are a malicious miner, the person in red, right, what you do is when you mine, you don't broadcast. Right? So you mine and you keep it only on your machine. Right? The honest miners are broadcasting to the network and propagating all their transactions. Right? So what you then do is you spend. Right? You spend your Bitcoin or your Ether or whatever it is. It gets accepted, it gets added to the blockchain, and it's broadcast to everyone, but you secretly mine, okay? And then at some point, if you get enough hashing power and you pull ahead, right? So now your blockchain is longer than the public blockchain, then you broadcast. You hit broadcast, and then all the old public blockchains get discarded. So what happens, essentially, you get the Bitcoins that you have already spent back, right? So you can now spend your Bitcoin again. And of course, there'll be a lot of collateral damage along the way. A lot of people whose transactions were in the later transactions all get undone, right? So this is how 51% attack works, right? So after you broadcast this, your blockchain, which was initially private, becomes the public blockchain. Now, once upon a time, in the heady early days of the blockchain, people regarded 51% attacks as academic in the pejorative sense of the word, meaning will never happen. So difficult, right? Unfortunately, that's not true. And the major blockchain network that has been compromised in January 2019 was Ethereum Classic. Before Ethereum Classic, you already had previous blockchains that were compromised, but those were really, really very small networks. Ethereum Classic was the first major blockchain network that was compromised in January 2019. And as if to drive home the point, in August of 2020, it was subjected to 3 separate 51% attacks successfully, right? So what I'm trying to say is 51% attacks are actually real. And as the value of what is recorded increases, then these attacks will increase. Again, unless you correspondingly increase the hash power of the entire network. So what does this tell us? What does the 51% attack tells us? It also tells us that the blockchain is not immutable. When we say immutable, we imagine that immutability is a black and white concept.
A simple question. Here you reported the percentage. So what is the actual number of attacks reported?
I don't have the full figures because very often networks that are attacked will not want to advertise it. It's the same problem with all cybersecurity.
In which scale, like 1,000 or 100?
Okay, so if we are talking about the Ethereum Classic 51% attack, right? I only have the figures for the August attacks. The three attacks compromised, the first attack compromised 3,693 blocks. So it unwound 3,693 blocks. The second attack unwound 4,000 blocks. And the third attack unwound over 7,000 blocks. And if you remember, each block contains hundreds, if not thousands of transactions. That's the number that is impacted, right? So it's a serious problem. So coming back to immutability, most of us think of something as either immutable or not immutable. It is black and white, right? That's the concept that comes to mind. But actually, immutability in the blockchain context is not like that. It's actually more 50 shades of gray. The earlier the transaction, the harder it is to undo because you have to maintain the hashing power for a longer period of time, which is why you have that advice if you're new to Bitcoin or Ether or so on and so forth. You may have heard that there's this 6-block rule for Bitcoin, right? You only treat the transaction as confirmed after 6 blocks have been added, right? The rule is different for different blockchains. So for Ether, it's 20 to 25 blocks. But don't imagine that means Bitcoin is faster because the amount of time between each block differs depending on the code used. So the blockchain for Bitcoin basically adds a new block roughly every 10 minutes. So if you follow the 6-block rule, that's 1 hour to get your coffee, right? Ether, although it's 20 to 25 transactions, because the time between each transaction is smaller, it works out to be roughly about 6 minutes only. So it's actually faster. But my interest is the demonstrating that immutability is not what you think it is. It just is increasingly immutable, not absolutely immutable. And you will see this when I talk about the DAO hack. So centralized versus decentralized networks. So as I said, the great advantage of centralized networks is you don't have to ensure consensus over anything. There's only one, and it will be consistent with itself. Doesn't mean it's accurate. It could be inaccurate, in which case you rectify it, right? That's the common solution to any problem, at least for legal registries, right? If there's a problem, you rectify it. Now, for decentralized networks, you will find that each of the nodes are equally authoritative, right? And the problem with decentralized networks, therefore, is, so for a centralized network, if you change the data, let's say you add a new transaction state changes, so it goes from red to yellow. For decentralized networks, you do it at a single node and then it propagates to the rest of the network. Now, the problem with decentralized networks is this, right? You can never guarantee that they are all the same all of the time. Why? You could have network failures, right? A link between nodes gets broken, and therefore the information is not propagated to the rest of the nodes, in which case what you have will be inconsistent nodes. Apart from that, you also have node failures. No? So it's not a link between the nodes, it's the node itself failing. So if, let's say we take out this node, then again, it cannot propagate. So again, you have inconsistent ledgers. Yes.
Sorry, Professor Lowe, there's a question for you on chat. If blockchain is not always trustable, can we still argue it can help one individual or entity trust another individual or entity?
Okay, so I will get to that slightly later, if you don't mind, because let me finish this first. I'll talk about the problem with what you mean by trust when I get to the legal perspective. So this will, I hope, become clearer. So there's node failure, and then there's something called Byzantine node failure. What is a Byzantine node failure? For normal node failure, the node completely fails. You know it has failed, right? Because maybe it has no power. So you don't get any information from it. A Byzantine node failure is called a Byzantine node failure because of a very famous article in computer science where they drew the metaphor with a number of Byzantine generals trying to invade a city. All right, so that's why it's called Byzantine node failure. In a Byzantine node failure, the node is not working properly, but it appears to be working. So what happens then? So you propagate the information, it hits this Byzantine node, then it sends wrong information to everyone else. Now, the problem here, unlike a normal node failure, is you don't even know it's malfunctioning, right? So the metaphor the computer scientists used was a traitorous Byzantine general, okay? And this is where Byzantine fault tolerance, the concept, comes from. Now, there are many, many problems. So you could have temporary forks, right? Where temporarily some of the networks look different from others. And this could be through no failure at all, because the mining scheme, right? Remember I talked about mining where miners solve problems. If two miners simultaneously solve the problem at the same time and they append different transactions, then what you will have is a temporary fork in the blockchain. And this happens more frequently than people realize, all right? There are many, many temporary forks all the time, okay? But more worrying than temporary forks are actually permanent forks, okay? And permanent forks tend to happen because you upgrade the software and a group of people don't want to upgrade for ideological or other reasons, right? So we'll talk about cryptocurrency forks in a minute. So this actually means that if you use the blockchain for legal function as a legal register, there are a number of problems. Let's leave aside the permanent forks first and temporary forks. When we have legal registries, let's say land registry, one of the functions of the registry is for people to go to the registry, check who is the registered owner so that I know I should be dealing with A and not B, right? Now, when there's a centralized register, then you go to the centralized register. If the register is wrong, normally there'll be a system whereby we impose liability on the registrar, right, for any losses that you suffer. But in a decentralized system, particularly, let's say with temporary forks, how do you know which node is going to be reliable, right? Because at one point, one of the miners' blockchains will be discarded. So if you relied on the wrong one and it is discarded, usually because of sheer dumb luck, right? Because sheer dumb luck, the next miner mines on blockchain A rather than blockchain B. Then turns out you've been dealing with the wrong person. Who do you seek recovery from, right? And on what basis do you seek recovery from this person, okay? But even worse than that is if you have a permanent fork, right? And I'm just going to run through the major forks. The first major fork, of course, was Ethereum, which forked into Ethereum and Ethereum Classic after the DAO hack, which I'll talk about slightly later. Then if you look at Bitcoin, good God, it has forked like hell, right? Bitcoin forked into Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, then Bitcoin forked again to Bitcoin Gold, Bitcoin Cash forked into Bitcoin adjustable block cap size and Bitcoin Satoshi's vision. Then Bitcoin forked again to Bitcoin and Bitcoin Private, which was a merger with Zcash. And then there's also supposedly Bitcoin Diamond. And then earlier this year, there was, I don't know what the state of this Bitcoin Satoshi's vision also forked. Now, why do these things happen? These things happen because we humans are so flexible that when we come together in large groups, we don't always agree, right? We can't get agreement. So whenever I think you see any particular blockchain community grow to a particular size, then you start seeing divisions. And when the divisions become ideological, they fork, right? Now, initially, in the early days of forks, right, the community regarded this as like, this is going to be catastrophe. This is the apocalypse, the end of blockchains, right? But then after that, they realized, hey, hang on a minute, actually no great harm. It's free money. And that's when they became a lot more blasé about forks. Now, for native crypto assets, you could arguably adopt that view, right? But if you're talking about using the blockchain as a legal register and you're trying to register, say, land, you can't, because when the register forks, there's still the only one plot of land, right? The land does not fork. It doesn't clone itself, right? So the forks are a serious, serious problem. So I come now to, I think, where there's that misunderstanding between lawyers and computer technicians. And this is the different perspective of security. For a lot of the computer tech people, when they talk about security, they're only concerned with whether my service is live. They're looking at it from a service provider point of view. Are my nodes live? If my nodes are live, then I'm fine. The fact that you can't reach my node because your network failed, that's your problem. The fact that your password got hacked, that's your problem. Again, not my problem. I don't care, right? And again, from a service provider point of view, let's say you are, I don't know, Netflix, you have multiple servers around the world. Some of your servers content slightly different because not updated correctly. So on particular server A, you don't have Lord of the Rings. Not the end of the world, right? But it's not like that for the law. The law is not concerned with whether the service is live. The law is concerned about security of the entire system all over. And very importantly, when we talk about security in the law, what we have is this tension between what we call static security and dynamic security. And this is most easily explained using a property system. So if A steals B's car and sells it to C, okay? A is the thief. No problem if you can find A, no problem if A is worth suing. But very often, if A is any good, you can't find A. Or if A is no good, you can find A, but A has got no money, not worth suing. Then it becomes a competition between B, the original owner, and C, the good faith purchaser. Who should win? Right? And there's no easy answer to this question. All legal systems face this tension. Who should win, B or C? Any rule that favors B, the original rule, original owner, is a rule that favors static security. Okay? Any rule that favors C, the good faith purchaser, is a rule that favors dynamic security. And very importantly, today's buyer is tomorrow's owner. So when you are entering the transaction as buyer, you think you want dynamic security. The problem is after you buy, you don't want dynamic security. So this is where it becomes essentially a devil's choice. Whatever you do, you've got to make somebody lose, right? And there's no legal system that is either absolutely static or absolutely dynamic. Most legal systems are somewhere in the middle, although most systems tend to be closer to the end that favors static security, right? Whether it's civilian or common law, they tend to favor static security. Now, a lot of people, particularly the tech people, seem to think registers are wonderful things. They are, whatever they say is authoritative and that's the end of it. That's not true, right? So in Hong Kong, you have a very old registration system which actually favors static security. And there's been a lot of talk about transitioning to a system that tends to favor more dynamic security, but it hasn't worked out, right? So the first time I moved to Hong Kong to work, I learned that you had just passed a land titles ordinance in 2004. As of today, that ordinance is still not enforced. Why? Because there's actually a hidden cost. So I like to use a case from Singapore. So in 2006, Bibi Binte Muhammad, who was a 90-year-old woman suffering from Alzheimer's disease, was defrauded of her land by her adopted daughter, who mortgaged her land without her permission to a bank, United Overseas Bank. Now, if you apply a normal favoring static security system, because her signature was forged, the transaction is just null and void. As between UOB and Bibi Binte Muhammad, Bibi should win. But when you move to a system that favors dynamic security, such as a land registration system, which Singapore has and which Hong Kong is proposing to move to, Bibi lost. So this is the cost of what we call indefeasibility in land law or dynamic security. Are you prepared to make that transition? Are you prepared for 90-year-old women with Alzheimer's always losing whenever they're hacked? Is that an outcome that you are happy with? Maybe you are. I don't know. I'm not. All right. Or at least I would require some safeguards. So coming now, therefore, to the question that was posed earlier, can it help to groups trust one another? That depends on your answer, right? 2, are you going to make them liable simply because one of them had their private key used? That's the ultimate question, right? If, let's say, Corporation A and Corporation B agree that they will, say, contract on the blockchain, all right? Then are you prepared for the conclusion that if either of them have their private keys used without their permission, this is the key, without their permission, they will nevertheless be bound, okay? Now, I think that if we are talking about large multinational companies transacting with one another and they know the ground rules and they're accepting the risk, fine, right? You're all adults, go ahead, okay? The problem is, how can you ensure that everybody has roughly equal bargaining power? Suppose I set up a system whereby, let's say I'm a group of diamond merchants, I'm the big players, right? I set up this system whereby if you want to join the network, you want to buy and trade diamonds, you have to sign up. But you're a small player, right? You don't have access to the kind of cybersecurity protections that we do. But if you want to make money in this network, these are the ground rules. You have to live with this. So then how do we deal with that, right? So the problem is, in the real world, there isn't ever a system whereby everybody has roughly equal bargaining power. Some people will feel kind of pressured to join. And should these people who feel pressured to join have to essentially play by these rules, whereby even if you didn't actually agree to the transaction, it appears you agreed because somebody hacked you, used your private key, you're bound, right? So that is the problem. I think where we're talking roughly equal bargaining powers, I have no issue. The problem is, how do we decide when it is always roughly equal bargaining power? So we come back to censorship resistance, right? Now, there's one problem with rectifying the blockchain. As I said, it can be done, right? You can unwind. You just need to get enough people to agree. The problem, of course, is, let's say your problematic transaction is here. To undo this transaction, you've got to undo everything. So all the honest transactions get undone together with the fraudulent one. So this is a huge problem with rectification. You can no longer rectify. And rectification is the standard legal remedy for legal registers. Whenever you find a legal register that is problematic, you go to court, you get it rectified. You can no longer rectify if you use a blockchain, right? Or to be more precise, a permissionless blockchain. Now, that doesn't mean the courts are powerless. Okay, I stress that doesn't mean the courts are powerless. I think what will happen instead of undoing is the courts will force the person, let's say, A steals B's house, transfers to C. Assuming the court decides that C should lose, the court can now order C to retransfer the house back to A. So it won't be rectification in the traditional sense of the word. It will be adding a new but equal and opposite transaction to the blockchain. But there are problems with this solution, okay? Because it still requires the compliance of the new owner. If the new owner refuses to sign off with the private key, the court can't do anything, right? Today's world, the court can do something. The court can sign for you, right? But if it's on the blockchain, and if you manage to keep your private key secure, it doesn't work. Now, of course, I can physically transfer the house, but that's not terribly useful to the original owner because now the register doesn't reflect him as the owner. So if he now wants to sell, he's going to find it hard to sell because the bank goes to the blockchain, sees, oh, actually, but you're not the owner. Why should I deal with you? Or even if somebody is willing to deal with you, he will ask for a discount, right? So this is not an ideal solution. And the problems with the people proposing the blockchain as a legal function, right, to use it legally, they haven't answered the problem. What are you going to do with the impact on judicial remedies, right? Because you don't have an adequate solution to what used to be very easily solved by rectification, okay? Now I come to the point where I want to talk about why I think Satoshi Nakamoto misunderstands, and most people misunderstand bank transfers. So many of us think that when we do an interbank transfer, we are transferring money. So A transfers A's money to B. The reason why most people don't understand this is because most people, including many lawyers, don't understand how banks actually work. So this is what people think happens, right? Annie transfers $10 to Clarabelle. And basically there's, a reduction of $10 in Annie's account and an increase of $10 in Clarabelle's account. Okay. Now, that's not actually how it works. Okay. If you are talking about an interbank transfer, what is a bank account? This is the first problem a lot of people don't understand, including lawyers. A bank account is a debt. You are lending money to the bank. So when you go to the bank and you hand over $10,000, what you're doing is you're lending the bank $10,000. Traditionally, the banks made money by then lending that money out at a higher interest rate, and they earn the spread, right? Now, of course, they make money in many other ways, but that's not what we're interested in. Now, because it is essentially a debt, right? There's a problem. If you have a different debtor, right? Notice Annie's bank account is with Bank A and Clarabelle's bank account is with Bank C. So at the beginning of the story, 10 of these dollars was owed by Bank A to Annie. And at the end of the story, that $10 is owed by Bank C to Clarabelle. How does that magically happen? You can't transform a debt. When we talk about transfer, we're talking about the same thing, right? But what happens is you have a new asset. What you see actually is a transfer of value, not a transfer of an asset, okay? So the easiest way to explain it is to first use a simple example. The simple example is, let's not have Bank A and Bank C. Let's assume there's only one bank, right? So you both bank with Hang Seng, let's say, right? And if you do a transfer from your account to somebody else who's also at Hang Seng's account, then it's easy because Hang Seng is the same debtor. All it does is it crosses out your account numbers. So instead of owing A $10, I will now owe C $10. That's easy. Now we come to the interbank transfers, right? Where you have different banks, then it becomes more complicated. You need the banks then to have themselves a bank so that you can adjust 4 ledgers, right? And it gets potentially more complicated with cross-border fund transfers, okay? So normally if it's within the jurisdiction, well, the central bank will serve that function. So if you're transferring within Hong Kong, whether from DBS to Hang Seng, HSBC to Wing Lung, it's easy, right? The central bank will serve as the common debtor to all the banks. So if you're transferring within the jurisdiction, costs are relatively low, practically free, right? It's where you have cross-border fund transfer that it becomes expensive. Why? Because you don't have the central bank. What then happens is other commercial banks step in. So HSBC and whichever the target bank is must find another bank where they have a common banking relationship. And if they can't find another bank, then they've got to find a bank who has a bank who has a bank. And in each level, there is a risk. There's a risk that when I transfer and I find out that the transaction is fraudulent, right? I can't unwind. And then the bank, might have to suffer loss, which is why the costs are so high for cross-border fund transfer. There's also the currency exchange element. And the fact, of course, that because banking institutions are regulated and therefore there's a barrier to entry, therefore, they can afford to charge you and you've got to take it, right? So this is what I mean by, this is actually how bank transfers work. Banks don't serve the function of preventing double transfers, right? Their function, the trust that you place in banks is that when you deposit $10,000, they will repay you, that they are solvent. That is the trust you put in them. If you're talking about faith in preventing double transfers, then nothing beats the current system from a game theory point of view, because the bank itself is on the hook, potentially. So if there's a fraudulent transfer from your account, right, meaning you didn't sign it, it's not your fault that the password was used, okay, then you just go to the bank and you say, no, I didn't authorize the transfer, put it back, right? And if the bank has, in the meantime, already transferred out the funds, the bank is the one that suffers the loss, okay? That's why the interbank transfer system is actually a lot more complicated than people realize, right? And so you can't actually say, okay, let's swap everything with a blockchain. It doesn't work, right? Because if you want to use the current system and you want to change it with blockchains, what you're talking about is multiple blockchains, because every relationship, every bank will have its own blockchain. And then you need the blockchains to talk to one another. You can only imagine how many potential problems that could create, all right? Plus, of course, another underappreciated fact, the reason why the banks run legacy networks is because they have to ensure backwards compatibility. Blockchains are not backwards compatible, I'm sorry. you can't just wipe the slate clean and move on, right? And assume that Bangladesh will catch up. Because if you say, okay, we're going to start transitioning to a blockchain network, everyone else, you just catch up, then you're going to leave behind all the developing countries. Doesn't work like that, all right? So other potential problems, smart contracts. So there are some blockchains that propose smart contract functionality, most famous of which is Ethereum, right? So what are smart contracts? Smart contracts, let's use the DAO. The DAO was the very famous smart contract, which was an investment mechanism whereby people invested Ether, and then they would vote on investment decisions. There wouldn't be a central manager of funds, and it would be majority wins. They call it democratization. I call it majoritarian rule. The problem, of course, was the code for the DAO was very badly written, and it was hacked. It raised about US $168 million, but about $50 million US was hacked and siphoned out of the DAO. And what happened then, of course, was because a lot of people were affected, they voted to wind back the Ethereum blockchain. And that's what created the fork between Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, and also goes to demonstrate that blockchain immutability is not what you think it is. It is only immutable until a majority decides to unwind, right? And although the cryptomaniacs like to call this democratization, it's not democratization, because if you're familiar with any democratic system, and it doesn't even have to be political, right? So if you look at constitutions, there's always constitutional protections for minority rights, right? If you look at corporate governance, again, there's protection for minority shareholders. So democratization doesn't work if you don't have safeguards for minorities. So if you run this sort of system, then you have a problem, which is that if, let's say, a lot of people are implicated by a hack, then more people are going to vote to unwind. But if less people are going to be implicated by a hack, then less people are going to vote to unwind. But essentially, in terms of whether they are affected, it's the same. So why should it depend on whether more or less people are hacked? Okay. Now, of course, this then introduces another problem, which is the smart contracts themselves are code. So there's the network code, the blockchain network code, and then there's the smart contract code. Now, smart contracts are what I call blind, deaf, and dumb. And dumb, I don't mean dumb, they can't speak. I mean dumb as in they're really stupid. What do I mean? So firstly, there's a lot of people who say, okay, wow, you can get rid of lawyers from now on because everything is going to be done by smart contracts. They're going to be self-executing. Everything's just going to happen on the blockchain. Yay, lawyers are expensive. Now, who are you proposing to replace lawyers with? You're proposing to replace lawyers with coders. Are coders cheap? No, they're not. Right? In fact, I would say that an average coder is probably more expensive than an average lawyer. Right? Because coding is actually very hard, and I'll get to that in a minute. Now, if you want to contract in code, you can, right? Nothing in the law stops you from contracting in code, but can you read code? Now, if you can't read code, then you better hire somebody to audit the code that's been written. What does that do? That costs money, again. So I'm not sure it's going to be cheaper than lawyers, okay? Secondly, now, the blockchain is so-called self-executing. It works for native blockchain assets like Bitcoin, like Ether, and so on and so forth. But let's say I want to buy a cup of cappuccino, all right? And it's a self-executing blockchain. So on the blockchain, it now signifies that that cup of cappuccino is now mine. Is that what I'm interested in? No, I'm actually interested in the actual goddamn cup of cappuccino. There's no delivery system. So the fact that you say on the blockchain that this cup of cappuccino belongs to Kelvin doesn't help me. It doesn't quench my thirst, right? It doesn't give me the sugar high or whatever it is I'm seeking, okay? So self-execution really is limited only to assets that are native to the blockchain. Things that are outside, you need other enforcement mechanisms, right? So you need the full machinery of the law, for example. So you still can't get rid of lawyers, right? You still need to hire the lawyer to go to court to say, yay, the blockchain says that the cup of cappuccino belongs to Kelvin. He hasn't drunk it yet. Pay up, right? So you haven't gotten rid of the lawyers. Another problem, even assuming we're talking about on-chain assets, right? Native assets. You have a credit problem. Now, of course, depending on your perspective, If for cryptomaniacs, this is not a problem because cryptomaniacs don't believe in credit. Right? Remember, this was out of the Great Recession, but credit is actually neither good nor bad. Right? Credit can be good if you use it for useful functions, right? If you make good use of the money that you borrow, it can allow you to, say, buy a house. Right? It can be bad, right? If you excessively leverage and you make a bad investment. So credit itself is neutral. It's neither good nor bad. But if you want smart contracts to work, you need to lock the assets even before the time for payment. Because otherwise, there's no way to guarantee that at the time of payment, you have the assets. So you must live in a world with no credits. In a world with no credits, the economy is going to be much smaller, right? Because the reason why the global economy is as big as it is because of credit. Right? Without credit, you take away credits, the economy is much smaller. We'll all lose money. Okay. And then, of course, a blockchain doesn't know what's going on in the real world. So it has to rely on oracles. Right? It's the kind of Roman oracles, right? But what are oracles? Oracles are basically, I don't know, third parties that provide a service, right? So if, let's say, you have a blockchain that pays out money if the flight doesn't take off because of bad weather. So you could have an oracle telling you the weather. Now, let's assume that everything that I've said about a blockchain not being secure is all false. Let's assume that the blockchain is perfectly secure. But are oracles secure? They're not. So again, this is another potential point of failure, right? So anything with smart contracts, you actually have additional points of failure. The oracles could be hacked, or even if it's not hacked, it could just simply be wrong. Right? I mean, we've seen websites with wrong information, right? No surprise. So then there's the whole drafting and code problem. A lot of legal language tends to be fuzzy, right? So you go and see a doctor. What does the doctor promise you? Does the doctor promise to cure you? No. No doctor is going to promise to cure you. The doctor is going to promise to use his best efforts and exercise reasonable care in curing you. Now, whether you are cured or not is in part dependent on the doctor's expertise, but also in part dependent on sheer dumb luck. Now, you can't code reasonable care. You can't code good faith. You can't code best efforts. It's just not codable. All right. But then what? Right? No doctor is going to agree that I will only be paid if you are cured. That's unacceptable. No patient is going to agree that I will pay you even if I'm not cured and you are crap. So then you have an impasse, right? Fuzzy language is essential to enable parties to agree. Reasonable care is the compromise everybody's happy with, right? And then there will be disputes over what is reasonable care. You go to court, right? In those cases, in many cases, there are actually no disputes. You can't code all these things, all right? Now, even assuming you're talking about the stuff that you can code, coding is actually a lot harder. I can't code, okay, but I've read about coding. It's a lot harder than people think. So it has been likened to writing War and Peace, but with no typos, okay, with no typos. That's a bloody long book to write with no typos, okay? In fact, it's actually worse than that, because you have to be very careful. A lot of things, if you write in natural language, you expect the reader to fill in the blanks, right? So if I tell you, I fried an egg, I don't have to tell you that I took the egg out of the refrigerator, I cracked open the egg and so on and so forth. You, the reader, will fill in the blanks. You can't do that with code, right? You've got to go through every single step. Open the fridge door, go to the compartment with the eggs. If there are no eggs there, go to the supermarket or blah, blah, blah. And, so all that has to be coded. So it's actually much harder writing in machine language than many people realize. So according to the leading text on coding, I believe by Steve McConnell, the industry average for coding errors is about 1 to 25 errors per 1,000 lines of code for delivered software, okay? Now, you can get to lower levels by paying more money. For better coders, we spend more time, right? So NASA can go down to almost nil, right? But it just costs money, right? So, can you imagine, if you hire a lawyer, he drafts badly, his English is crap. What will happen if you go to court? The judge will use the context to fill in the blanks, right? We'll add commas, delete words, imply terms to make it work. With smart contracts, there's no one that can do that. There's nobody crossing your T's, there's nobody dotting your I's. You have got to get it right, which means not cost effective, right? Unless you're talking large scale repeat transactions. And in fact, I would suggest really only small parts of the contract. So smart clauses, not smart contracts, right? Smart contracts are a horrible idea, especially if it's bespoke. Now, as the number of lines of code increases, right, as your code gets longer, the density of defects also increases, right? So this is average, but if you have a longer code, then your number of errors per 1,000 lines of codes will be higher, right? Not lower, not just double. So if you're 2,000, it's not double, it's 2 point something. If you're 3,000, it's not triple, it's 3 point something or 4 point something, right? Now, and let me just share with you the Ethereum smart contract in 2016. Ethereum uses a coding language called Solidity. It's $100 per 1,000 lines of code, right? So that is just absolute crap. So what do I think will happen if everybody transitions to smart contracts, especially using Ethereum Solidity? What will happen is instead, you will change the parties suing each other, right? So the normal complaint the tech people give about lawyers, for example, is A contracts with B, then if B doesn't perform, A will have to sue B, right? But if you transition to smart contracts, right, and then there's automated transfer, let's say of on-chain assets again. So the Bitcoins are transferred automatically from B to A, but then it's because of a coding error. What will happen? So now A doesn't sue B, B will have to sue A to get the money back. That's all that will change. You're still going to have lawyers. So if you're a law student watching this, don't worry, your jobs are secure. You have more danger from AI than blockchains. Okay. It's just that the party initiating the lawsuit will be different. Instead of A suing B, it will be B suing A. So basically, to wind this all up, essentially there is a failure to understand that when we talk about security, we have two very different perspectives. Most tech people, because they come from a service provision background, are thinking in terms of, is my system live? And they don't care about consistency because it's better to have 99% live than 0% live. Okay? Lawyers cannot think like that. Judges cannot think like that. Lawmakers cannot think like that. We have to be concerned with overall society systemic security. And we are concerned with that very difficult security, which is the tension between dynamic and static security. And that is a zero-sum game, okay? So for that reason, I don't think the blockchains will really work as a solution for the law, because it also introduces other problems like taking away judicial remedies like rectification. It makes a lot of court orders a lot less useful. And for the law to then adopt it, you need to have viable workarounds, right? Which does not exist and nobody has found them, okay? And smart contracts, I'm less skeptical, but I think there is a function, but you need to be very careful where you implement it, all right? And you need to be implementing it, in small doses, right? Don't think that you can code your entire contract. Because the moment you're thinking that, you're asking for trouble. You want to be able to code particular parts which are highly repetitious so that over time you debug, right? So there, I think that there is some use, but not what the cryptomaniacs are suggesting. Lawyers are not going to be out of a job anytime soon. All right. So I think with that, I can end my presentation. I'll take questions now.
Thank you very much for sharing your ideas around cryptography and around blockchain in general. I think what you've spoken about today definitely evaluated very popular claims, and you definitely have separated the hype from real facts around blockchain. With that said, I would like to say thank you again very much, and I would like to conclude the joint seminar today. Once again, I would like to express our deepest gratitude towards the support and the presence of our honorable.
We're still with your open floor for questions.
Okay. All right, I'd like to open the floor for questions. Apologies.
Professor Law,
Yes.
can I ask, I noticed that you have a relatively negative feeling about this, different from technical persons you mentioned that they are more positive on this point. So from your understanding in the legal system, lawyers, governors, what is the percent taking positive views and what is the percent taking negative views?
Okay, so I can't give you a percentage because I haven't done any survey. But I don't think that if I look at the literature, right, in terms of the legal literature writing about blockchains, I would say that there is far more positive literature than there is negative literature. But again, the problem with the positive literature is a lot of them don't understand the technology. So when I look at the early law articles about the blockchain, they seem to assume that the blockchain is perfectly secure. And if you assume that something is perfectly secure, it will revolutionize the law. Because if you provide perfect security, then you solve the problem that the law has to deal with, which is the tension between static and dynamic security. So a lot of the articles that talk about the blockchain and they don't go into the technical details, they don't go into the cybersecurity flaws. I think those need to be discounted. What I think you tend to see more of today is still relatively positive. There are now increasingly more negative views, but I think we are still in the minority. But there is now increasingly a slightly more sophisticated positive view, which takes the view that yes, the blockchain is not perfectly secure, but it is more secure than a centralized system. Okay. Now, there are problems with this view. So firstly, when you talk about a centralized system, the cybersecurity for a centralized system is not static. It depends on how much money you throw at it. Right now, of course, you get to the point of diminishing returns, right? But it is not a static point. Okay. The more you spend, the more secure it is. Right. Also, and this is a point that people who try to suggest that the blockchains are more or decentralized ledgers are more secure, which they don't talk about as well, which is nobody that runs a centralized ledger doesn't keep backups. Nobody, right? So when they talk about a single point of failure, no, it does not exist. You have got to be the most useless registrar in the world to run a centralized ledger and don't have backups, right? All registrars will have offline backups, okay? So you are not talking about single point of failure. There's no system, right, which is of any importance which has single point of failure, okay? So let's come to more secure. Very often I've come across in the legal literature, people talking about, okay, if there are n numbers of nodes, then the degree of difficulty in hacking the network multiplies by n. Right? So if there are 10 nodes, then it's 10 times harder. 20 nodes, 20 times harder. Obviously false. Why? Because as I've explained to you, it depends on permission or permissionless. Right? Permission, you only need to compromise 1/3. So if it's 30 nodes, you only need to compromise 10. If it's 60 nodes, you only need to compromise 20. Right? So it doesn't scale the same way. And very importantly, they don't talk about extra costs. Okay, so if you want to maintain 30 nodes, it will cost 30 times as much. So if you're increasing your cost by 30 times, okay, for the person running the nodes, but you're only increasing the cost for the hacker by 10 times. Question is that cost effective? I don't think it is, right? Now, then we talk about permissionless systems. As I said, you don't even need to hack anyone. Just rent a supercomputer, right, for 10 hours, whatever, however much time you feel you need, and you hack the system. Because you just download the software, run it on your system, ta-da, the system is compromised. So from a cost-benefit analysis, I don't see the benefit, right? Now, I'm not saying that, therefore, blockchains are useless. What I'm saying is you need to dial down the hype. Think about ways where this sort of risks are not high. So one of the few instances, but it's got nothing to do with the law, right? So I can't think of a use case for blockchains for the law. right? But outside of the law, maybe. So food provenance tracking, okay? Now, provenance tracking using a blockchain could be useful if what you're trying to do is, if it's an accidental, let's say, contamination. So you want to find out which products have been contaminated, and assuming the contamination is accidental, then the blockchain could help. But then again, I do question, do you need a blockchain, or can you use a hash chain, meaning a centralized, not decentralized, single registry, which is going to be more cost effective. It allows you to trace the product right through the chain. Now, but I also want to caution this. It doesn't work where it is worthwhile to commit fraud. So, if it's worthwhile, I can substitute horse meat for beef or lamb, right? Then it doesn't work because, a lot of people talk about the blockchain as a truth machine, right? But it's rubbish in, rubbish out, right? You got to rely on somebody to enter the data. So if there is money to be made, so you can never trust the blockchain to prevent fraud, I think is my point. You can use it usefully. So food provenance tracking, if you want to find where the contaminated items are now, so because it's accidental, nobody's trying to fiddle around with it. The records are going to be 99% of the time useful. That's, I think, a good use case. But again, like I said, you can use a hash chain without using a blockchain, right? And probably save some money at that. But once fraud comes in, if it's worthwhile, say diamonds, for example, right? You think that if the world's diamonds transition to a blockchain, I guarantee the fraudsters will follow. Right? It's a bit like the internet, right? So it was wonderful, you're freely disseminating information. Then now you're starting to see all the problems, fake news disseminating everywhere. Then how do you solve the problem? Same thing here.
Another question.
Well, I have a question. So it seems to me you brought a very interesting example about the static security and dynamic security. So it seems to me that neither the current system nor the blockchain technology solve this problem. Do you think this is a problem that can be solved from a technical perspective, or it is a problem that cannot? We should bring legal or law solution on this. So what's your opinion?
So you need to look at it at two different levels, right? Can you prevent fraud? Okay. And I think the answer to that problem, unfortunately, is no. So long as you're living in a society with other human beings, right? There will be fraud. Human beings are endlessly inventive in creating new ways to defraud other people. Okay. So you can't just simply look at previous frauds and assume that there won't be new ways. And even old frauds work. So I don't know, we all receive these emails from Nigerian princes, right? And we all laugh. Who on earth falls for it? Actually, a lot of people. That's why the emails keep sending out, right? They just need 1 out of 1,000 people to fall for it, and they make money. Okay, so you can't prevent fraud. Okay, so that's the first problem. And so once you can't prevent fraud, that tension will always be there. And the question is how you balance, right? Whether you move between static and dynamic security and how you provide the extra security, so to speak. So let me talk a little bit about land registration system, because I'm a land lawyer actually. And very often most people don't care about land law, but this is actually quite interesting. So if you look at the common law land system, and you just apply the common law rules, it is very heavily in favor of static security, right? All subsequent owners will lose to the original owner so long as he did not freely enter into that transaction, right? So if anybody forges a signature, it's a nullity. I don't care how much care you exercise, you, the new buyer, lose all the time, okay? Now this, of course, operates very harshly on purchases, good faith purchases. And in Australia, they created a system called torrents registration, which moves the needle towards dynamic security. They face tremendous resistance from existing landowners. No surprise, because they stand to lose, right? Because you move the needle, then I'm the existing owner. I like static security. What do I get out of it? Right? And this is the reason why in Hong Kong, even though you passed your land titles ordinance in 2004, you can't switch because the problem is insurance. So the way the Australians got around it was they set up a scheme, an insurance scheme, state-backed, right? So that if you lose money because your land was transferred fraudulently and it was through the operation of the system, you will be compensated. But the question is, where's the money going to come from? Right? It can only come from two places. One, you charge more for land transfers, right? So every piece of land transfer, you charge a cut. Then you take that money, you put it into the fund so that if there's any fraud, you pay out. And that's one way of funding it. If you don't do that, which people don't like because people don't like paying money for anything, then you've got to raise it from taxes, which is arguably worse because who are the landowners? The landowners tend to be the wealthy. Taxes are paid by usually a larger segment of society. Why should the middle class be subsidizing the wealthy, right? So that's how the Australians got around it. So why can't you get around it in Hong Kong? Because your government has set the insurance cap at an unrealistically low level, right? I think it's in the tens of millions of Hong Kong dollars, but with property values being what they are in Hong Kong, that's no comfort at all. If I own $100 million house in Hong Kong, your promise to me to pay me for any loss up to 20 million is not very comforting, right? So, but it is helpful in the sense that it can overall reduce costs, right? So the system is overall more secure, okay? There's less loss across the board, but you will never get it down to nil. Okay, you will never get it down to nil. That's the problem. So in the Singapore case, Bibi Binti Muhammad, Singapore is a very strange jurisdiction which operates the torrent system because we have a very, very narrow insurance scheme, right? Unlike other torrent systems whereby it's no fault payout. In Singapore, there is only payout if the registry is at fault. And BB was very lucky because the court suggested that the registry was at fault. Now, the court honestly shouldn't have done that because the registry was not party to the litigation. And I happen to know the people in the registry and they're very upset that they had to pay out. The problem, of course, if you look at the Singapore insurance system, is that there isn't actually a lot of money in that. Two good class bungalows in Singapore hit with fraud, the money is exhausted, right? So the point is, it's an insoluble problem. You can minimize overall, and I think a land registration system is overall better than what you have today in Hong Kong, which is a deeds registration system. I do think it is better overall, but it is not a no-cost system, and everybody needs to go into it with their eyes open as grown-ups, right? As opposed to the magical fairy, I wave my wand and everything works, which is the problem with the land registration system in Hong Kong. People think that, I just need to go to a land registration system, everything works. No, it doesn't.
I'd like to just ask one last time on the group chat on Zoom. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to either ask them or to raise them in the chat room. Otherwise, if there's no questions, I would like to once again thank Professor Low for sharing today. I think everyone learned a lot. It was really insightful, not just for me, but I think for all students and anyone who's an enthusiast or in anything related to blockchain. So yes, I'd like to say thank you once again for your sharing. And I'd like to remind I'd like to remind anyone in attendance that the next lecture in the joint seminar series will be held at the end of January, and we look forward to seeing you there.